There are places that don't disappear all at once. They go quiet first. A missed report, a skipped transmission, a logbook entry that trails off mid-sentence. And then, somewhere in the distance between one bureaucratic filing and the next, they simply stop existing. Kara 7 was one of those places. The northern edge of Novaya Zemlya is not a place that invites visitors. It is a long, pale curve of rock and frozen soil pressed between the Kara Sea and the Barents, sitting at latitudes where the sun vanishes for months at a time, and where wind doesn't so much blow as press, a constant, low, structural force that shapes everything it touches. Soviet planners had established weather monitoring outposts across the Arctic archipelago beginning in the late 1940s, part of a broader program to track atmospheric conditions across the northern theater. The stations were small, functional, and unglamorous. They existed to collect data, and the men who staffed them existed to make sure the data arrived. Kara 7 was one of the more remote installations in the network, not the farthest, but far enough that resupply required deliberate planning rather than routine transit. It sat on the northeastern coastline, positioned to capture Kara Sea atmospheric readings that the larger stations further south couldn't reliably reach. The station itself consisted of 2 connected prefabricated structures, a radio mast, a diesel generator, housed in a separate insulated shed, and a small cache of emergency provisions buried beneath the floor of the main building. It had been operational since 1957, staffed by rotating crews of 3 to 5 observers assigned in 8-month shifts. The men who passed through Kara 7 were meteorologists in a Soviet institutional sense, trained in atmospheric measurement, familiar with the equipment, and accustomed to the particular silence of Arctic postings. They were not explorers or adventurers. They were civil servants in a remote office, recording temperature gradients and barometric pressure and wind direction into logbooks that were later transmitted by radio to a collection facility in Arkhangelsk. The work was methodical. The logbooks from 1957 through early 1961 reflect this. Dense columns of figures, brief weather notes, occasional maintenance observations. Nothing unusual, nothing worth remarking on. The testing program on Novaya Zemlya had been expanding steadily since the late 1950s. The Soviet nuclear test site occupied the southern portion of the archipelago, and while Kara 7 sat well north of the primary detonation zones, the atmospheric effects of large-yield tests were not contained by geography. Observers at northern stations had noted pressure anomalies, unusual electromagnetic interference with radio equipment, and in some cases, temporary disruptions to instrument calibration following major detonations. None of this was formally flagged as a problem. The station continued to report. The data continued to arrive in Arkhangelsk, and then, in the early months of 1962, it didn't. The last complete logbook entry for Kara 7 that appears in any declassified Soviet archive is dated February 9th, 1962. It records standard atmospheric readings, wind from the northeast at approximately 32 kilometers per hour, temperature at minus 27 Celsius, barometric pressure stable, visibility reduced by blowing snow. It is written in the same tidy, compressed handwriting that appears throughout the preceding pages. There is no indication that anything unusual was expected or occurring. The entry ends, as all the others do, with the observer's initials, VM. After that, the logbook is blank. What makes the silence that follows unusual is not the silence itself. Arctic stations had experienced interruptions before, usually attributable to equipment failure or severe weather, but the absence of any administrative response to it. When a station went offline, Soviet protocols were clear. The collection facility in Arkhangelsk would flag the gap, a supervisor would initiate contact attempts, and if contact could not be reestablished, a formal inquiry would be opened. For Kara 7, no such inquiry appears in the record. The gap in atmospheric data for the northern Kara Sea region begins on February 10th and continues without comment. Soviet administrative culture in this period was, if anything, obsessive about documentation. Personnel assignments, transfer orders, duty rosters, disciplinary notes, even requests for additional supply allocations, all of it moved through formal channels and generated paper trails that were preserved with considerable consistency. The personnel file system maintained by the Meteorological Service was thorough enough that researchers working with declassified Arctic records decades later were generally able to reconstruct the names, assignments, and eventual postings of virtually every station observer from this era. For the crew assigned to Kara 7's final rotation, that reconstruction fails. There are no transfer papers. There are no discharge records. There are no death certificates. The crew for the final rotation at Kara 7 can be identified from old records, as assignment orders from August 1961 list 3 names for an 8-month period starting that September. One name is partly clear with a first initial of V and a last name starting with M, which matches the initials at the end of the last logbook entry. The other 2 names are hidden by missing text or damage that makes them hard to read. After that August 1961 order, none of the 3 people appear in any later Soviet personnel records that are open to researchers. There is a clear difference between the loss of information caused by administrative neglect and the loss caused by intentional action. Neglect leads to messy records with missing pieces and accidental gaps. Intentional removal creates a different result where the absence is too smooth and consistent to be a mistake. The Kara 7 records have that second quality. The missing information does not look like poor organization. It looks like the space where something used to be. The atmospheric data record for the northern Kara Sea region, maintained separately from the station logbooks in a collection archive in Arkhangelsk, shows a clean discontinuity beginning February 10th, 1962. Prior to that date, readings arrive at regular intervals, consistent with the station's established reporting schedule. After that date, the data simply stops, not interrupted by a different station or supplemented by alternative measurements, but absent. When Soviet planners apparently made decisions about northern Arctic monitoring coverage in the months that followed, they appear to have done so without the data Kara 7 had been providing. Whether that absence created problems for the meteorological network is not recorded. The only record of the Kara 7 office closing is a note in a 1964 review of Arctic work sites. It lists the station as a facility that was closed for environmental reasons. The note does not explain the environmental issues. It does not list a closing date. It does not name the staff who were there or where they went next. It was written 2 years after the logs stopped, and it has no mention of a formal review or a final report. It is the last time Kara 7 appears in any official record. Whatever happened at the station that caused 3 men to stop sending reports and led to a lack of paperwork was reduced in the end to 4 words. The question of what could silence a Soviet Arctic station in February of 1962 is not a simple one. The explanations that come most readily to mind, equipment failure, severe weather, a medical emergency, all share a common feature. They generate documentation. A broken radio mast requires a repair order. A crew member incapacitated by illness or injury requires a medical report. Even a complete station abandonment, carried out under emergency conditions, would ordinarily produce some trace in the supply chain, the transport logs, or the personnel system. The absence of any such trace is, in its own way, a kind of evidence. The winter of 1961 to 1962 was not notably severe by Arctic standards, at least not according to the regional atmospheric data that was still being collected by stations further south. There were no recorded storm events of unusual intensity in the northern Kara Sea area during the weeks surrounding February 9th. The last logbook entry describes blowing snow and reduced visibility, conditions that were routine for the location and season, conditions the station had operated through dozens of times before. Whatever ended Kara 7's reporting, was not, apparently, a weather event of the kind that would have registered in the broader meteorological record. The nuclear testing timeline offers a different kind of context. The Soviet program on Novaya Zemlya had reached its most intensive phase in the preceding months. The Tsar Bomba detonation had taken place in October 1961, just weeks before the final rotation at Kara 7 began its assignment. That test, the largest nuclear detonation in recorded history, had been conducted at the southern test site, several hundred kilometers from Kara 7's position. The shockwave had been documented at monitoring stations across the northern hemisphere. At Kara 7's latitude and bearing, the atmospheric effects would have been measurable. Pressure anomalies, instrument disruption, likely some degree of electromagnetic interference with radio equipment. Whether any of that interference was recorded in the station's final logbook pages is unknown, because those pages, if they exist, have never appeared in any archive. What is known is that the Soviet testing program generated its own parallel bureaucracy, a separate chain of documentation maintained by the military and scientific apparatus responsible for the tests, distinct from the civilian meteorological service that administered stations like Kara 7. Requests submitted through official channels for access to testing-related records from this period have, in most cases, either been denied on security grounds or returned as incomplete. The overlap between what the testing program might have produced in terms of atmospheric effects and what a small northern station might have encountered remains, officially, unexamined. There is a researcher, a Finnish atmospheric scientist, who spent 3 decades studying Cold War Arctic monitoring records, who spent several years in the 1990s attempting to reconstruct the data gap left by Kara 7's silence. He submitted formal requests to Russian archival institutions under the post-Soviet records access agreements of that period, asking specifically for any documentation related to the station's closure or the personnel assigned to its final rotation. What he received after a delay of 14 months was a thin folder containing photocopies of documents he had already located in other collections, and a letter stating that no additional records pertaining to Kara 7 had been located. He noted in a published paper that the phrasing of the letter was careful, not that no additional records existed, but that none had been located. He considered that distinction worth remarking on. The physical site of Kara 7 has not, to any documented account, been formally inspected by outside researchers. The northeastern coast of Novaya Zemlya remains a restricted zone under Russian federal law, designated as part of the national park established in the 1990s, but still subject to access controls that predate the park's creation by several decades. Satellite imagery of the approximate area where the station would have been situated, derived from coordinates listed in the 1957 installation records, shows what may be structural remains partially buried under accumulated drift, though the resolution and angle of available imagery makes confident identification impossible. No expedition has been permitted to investigate. The men who staffed Arctic weather stations in this era were, by most accounts, selected for their steadiness as much as their technical competence. The postings were long, isolated, and psychologically demanding in ways that the Soviet institutional literature tended to understate. 8 months at a station like Kara 7, through the full depth of an Arctic winter, with radio as the only connection to the world outside. That kind of assignment required a particular disposition. The observers who thrived in such postings were generally described by their supervisors as methodical, self-contained, and resistant to anxiety. They were people who found the silence manageable. The records from other Arctic stations of that time show what daily life at Kara 7 was like, as entries were brief and factual, with observations noted at set times and maintenance tasks listed simply when the long shifts and weather became tiring. The staff showed this through extra work, like checking the generator twice or organizing supplies again. These small actions showed how they felt, instead of direct comments. But the final entry at Kara 7 had none of these signs and read just like all the others before it. One detail that researchers have found difficult to account for is the radio silence itself. The station's radio equipment was a standard Soviet Arctic installation unit, reliable by the standards of the period, maintained on a regular schedule, and capable of transmitting on emergency frequencies independent of the primary reporting system. If the crew had experienced any kind of emergency severe enough to end the station's operations, the expected response would have been to transmit on those emergency frequencies. The collection facility in Arkhangelsk maintained a continuous monitoring capability. No emergency transmission from Kara 7 was ever logged. Either the crew had no opportunity to transmit, or the equipment was non-functional, or the transmission was sent and not recorded. None of those possibilities is straightforwardly reassuring. The region's geology adds another layer of context that is rarely discussed in connection with Kara 7. The northeastern coast of Novaya Zemlya sits above a zone of permafrost that, in the early 1960s, was poorly mapped and incompletely understood. Ground instability in this type of terrain can produce effects that are sudden and, in certain configurations, structurally catastrophic: sinkholes, foundation failures, the collapse of insulated structures that appear stable until they aren't. A station built on inadequately surveyed permafrost would have had no warning of such failure. But a structural collapse of that kind would also typically leave physical evidence recoverable by inspection, and no inspection appears to have taken place. There is something in the administrative record that sits oddly alongside everything else. A supply manifest dated March 1962, roughly 6 weeks after the last logbook entry, that lists Kara 7 as a scheduled resupply destination for a vessel operating out of Arkhangelsk that spring. The manifest was part of a broader logistics document for Arctic Station resupply operations. Kara 7 appears on it without any notation indicating that the station was known to be inactive. The vessel's actual voyage records from that season have not been located. Whether the resupply run was completed, aborted, or simply never carried out is unknown. But the manifest's existence suggests that as of March 1962, whoever was responsible for station logistics either did not know that Kara 7 had gone silent, or had chosen not to update the supply schedule to reflect that fact. The 1964 infrastructure review note that formally closed the station was produced by a department within the Soviet Meteorological Service that was responsible for evaluating the ongoing utility of remote installations. The review covered dozens of stations across the Arctic network, assessing each for operational viability, maintenance costs, and strategic value. Most of the entries in the review are detailed: staffing histories, equipment assessments, data quality evaluations, recommendations for upgrade or closure. The Kara 7 entry is 4 lines. It gives no staffing history for the final rotation. It provides no equipment assessment. The phrase environmental unsuitability appears without definition, without reference to any supporting technical evaluation, and without the name of the official who made the determination. Every other closure in the same review document cites a specific reason, a responsible official, and a date. Kara 7 cites none of these. The term environmental unsuitability in Soviet reports is unclear because it refers to different site conditions. Sometimes it meant natural ground issues like soil shifts or erosion. Other times it described areas where past work made normal operations difficult. In rare cases, it referred to locations where safety rules restricted future site access without explaining the specific cause. The review document does not say which meaning applies to Kara 7, and it does not show that anyone tried to clarify the matter. By the mid-1960s, the Soviet Arctic Monitoring Network had been reorganized and partially consolidated, with a number of smaller installations closed in favor of larger, better-equipped stations. Kara 7's data coverage was not replaced. The Northern Kara Sea atmospheric readings that the station had provided simply became a gap in the network's output, one that persisted for years. Whether that gap affected Soviet meteorological science in any meaningful way is difficult to assess, because the records that would allow such an assessment are the same records that remain incomplete or inaccessible. The network adapted around the absence. The silence was absorbed, institutionally, without apparent comment. Stop transcription here. There is no photograph of Kara 7 in any publicly accessible archive. There is no personnel file that includes a picture of any of the 3 men assigned to its final rotation. The station exists in the record as a set of logbook entries, a handful of administrative references, and a 4-line closure note that explains nothing. Somewhere on the northeastern coast of Novaya Zemlya, under however many decades of Arctic drift and ice accumulation, there may be a structure, or the remains of one, that could answer at least some of the questions the paper record leaves open. That structure, if it exists, sits behind a restricted boundary that has not been open to outside investigation. It waits, as things in the Arctic tend to wait, in the particular patience of cold and silence. The people who study Cold War Arctic history professionally tend to speak about cases like Kara 7 with a particular kind of careful restraint. They are trained to resist the pull toward conclusion, to hold the evidence at arm's length and describe only what can be verified. But even within that discipline, there is a category of case that resists easy classification, not because the evidence points towards something fantastical, but because the shape of the absence is too deliberate to be accidental, and too consistent to be explained by ordinary bureaucratic failure. Kara 7 belongs to that category. The researchers who have spent time with its records tend not to claim answers. They tend instead to describe what they found and go quiet. The Finnish researcher who spent years reviewing the station records published his findings in a small academic journal in 2001. The paper was not widely circulated. It ran to 11 pages and concerned itself primarily with the data gap in the Northern Kara Sea atmospheric record, which was a technical subject framed in the language of meteorological science. But in its final section, he included a single paragraph that departed from that register. He wrote that the Kara 7 record, taken in its entirety, was consistent with a site that had been administratively closed because the project had reached its conclusion and the records were no longer being updated. He offered no speculation about why. He simply noted the consistency, cited his sources, and ended the paper. The distinction he was drawing is a fine one, but it matters. A station that stops functioning leaves a different kind of trace than a station that is made to stop existing. Malfunctions generate repair requests. Evacuations generate transport records. Deaths generate death certificates. The Soviet system was not perfect, but it was thorough enough that genuine accidents, even in remote locations, tended to produce documentation of some kind. Not always complete, not always honest, but present. The absence at Kara 7 is not the absence of a malfunctioning system. It is the absence of a system that was, apparently, working as intended. There is a specific period in early 1962 that carries additional significance when viewed against the broader context of Soviet Arctic activity. In the weeks surrounding February 9th, the date of Kara 7's last logbook entry, the testing program on Novaya Zemlya was in a transitional phase following the intensive detonation series of the previous autumn. Post-test atmospheric monitoring was a priority for Soviet military science during this period. Understanding how radioactive particulates and pressure effects moved through Arctic air masses was considered strategically important. A civilian weather station in the northern Kara Sea, positioned precisely where post-test atmospheric tracking would have been most useful, would have been collecting data that intersected directly with military scientific interests. Whether that intersection had any bearing on what happened to Kara 7 is not something the available record allows anyone to say with confidence. What the record does allow is a narrower observation that the station's silence and its subsequent administrative treatment are most consistent with a decision made at a level above the Meteorological Service's normal operational authority. The 4-line closure note in the 1964 review was not produced by a field supervisor or a regional administrator. The department responsible for that review reported to ministry-level officials. A closure entry that deviated so sharply from the review's standard format that omitted every element that every other entry included would not have gone unnoticed by the officials who compiled the document. It would have been produced the way it was produced, because that was how someone wanted it produced. The 3 men named in the August 1961 order did not appear in any records after that time, as there are no pension files or home addresses or letters found in any archives. The system tracked its people well enough that the total absence of 3 individuals from every office system at once is a rare event. It happens that files are lost or people are missed by even the best systems. But 3 men at once from the same place, with no trace in any other system, is a different kind of event. There are families, presumably somewhere in the record, parents, siblings, perhaps wives or children of the men who staffed Kara 7's final rotation. Whether those families were told anything, and if so, what they were told, is unknown. The Soviet practice in cases involving classified or sensitive deaths was not uniform. Sometimes families received formal notification, sometimes they received vague explanations of accidents or transfers, sometimes they received nothing at all, and were left to interpret the silence on their own. There is no record, in any accessible archive, of a notification being sent to anyone in connection with the Kara 7 personnel. If someone received a letter, or a visit, or a phone call explaining what had happened to the men at that station, no trace of it has survived, in a form that researchers have been able to locate. The coastline where Kara 7 stood, or stands if anything remains, is part of a landscape that the 20th century used hard. Novaya Zemlya absorbed more nuclear detonations than any other test site on Earth during the Cold War period. The soil, the water, the permafrost beneath the surface, all of it carries a burden of contamination that official assessments have described in various ways over the decades, ranging from negligible to significant, depending on who was producing the assessment and when. The islands were officially declared a national park in 1994, a designation that carries a particular irony given the history of what was done there. The park's boundaries encompass the test sites. They also encompass the approximate location of Kara 7. Recent research efforts have produced a large volume of material relating to the project, including technical documents and project reports. The release of information has been helpful in some respects and limited in others, as most review processes are. Documents relating to project parameters and site assessments have been shared in partial form, enough to confirm the general outline of what happened, but not enough to fill in the details that would matter most to anyone trying to understand specific activities. The category of document most consistently absent from the released material is the category that would address what happened to people who were working in different areas at different times. There is a particular silence that settles over a place that has been deliberately forgotten. It is different from the silence of a place that was simply abandoned or overlooked. The difference is difficult to articulate, but researchers who work in Cold War history often describe something like it. A quality in the record where the absence has texture, where the missing pieces fit together too neatly, where the gaps align in ways that random loss does not produce. The Kara 7 record has that quality. The logbook entries stop. The personnel vanish from the system. The administrative note offers 4 words and no names. The supply manifest lists a resupply that apparently never happened or left no record. Each gap, taken alone, might be explainable. Together, they describe a shape. That shape is not a conclusion. It cannot be, given what the record contains. It is possible, genuinely possible, that the crew of Kara 7 experienced a rapid and complete equipment failure that coincided with a bureaucratic breakdown so thorough that it erased them from every parallel record simultaneously. It is possible that environmental unsuitability referred to something mundane, a structural failure, a location problem, and that the sparse documentation was the result of a department under pressure, cutting corners on closure paperwork. It is possible that the 3 men are listed somewhere in a file that has not been declassified, or that was damaged, or that sits in a regional archive that no outside researcher has yet examined. Possibility is not the same as probability. The last logbook entry ends mid-page. Below the final line of figures and the initials VM, the rest of the page is blank. The pages that follow are blank. The binding shows that the logbook was not full. There were many pages remaining when the entries stopped. Whatever VM and the others expected to do the following day and the day after that, they had a logbook ready to receive it. The entries simply never came. The book sat, presumably, in the same place where it had always sat, on the small shelf or table where station logbooks were kept, until something happened that meant it would never be picked up again. What that something was, the book does not say. It only says, in the neat, compressed handwriting of February 9th, 1962, that the wind was from the northeast, the temperature was -27, and visibility was reduced by blowing snow. Some records close with answers. Some close with ambiguity that time eventually resolves. And some close in the way that Carré 7 closes, not with a conclusion, but with a silence that has lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. Whatever the station held, whatever the men who staffed it last saw or recorded or understood before the logbook went blank, it remains on that coastline, sealed beneath the ice and the decades and the careful administrative nothing that followed. The Arctic does not give back what it keeps. And neither, it seems, does the system that decided Carré 7 was better forgotten than explained.